Friedrich Nietzsche once said that he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. And one of the hardest things in life is finding meaning in our most difficult experiences. So in this episode, we talk about karma, about reincarnation, and about how experience can lead us to enlightenment. Welcome back to the Spiritual Freedom Show with Richard Lawrence, the podcast helping seekers of truth, of spirituality, and psychic powers to discover true fulfillment. Hi, I'm Darren Ball, co-host of the show, and in this episode we'll be talking about the connection between your spiritual destiny and the purpose of the whole of creation. We'll also be talking about the truth about karma and its role in your spiritual evolution. And finally, we'll be sharing the story of someone who is able to turn adversity to advantage, or those difficult experiences into something really positive throughout their life, and raise the consciousness of humanity as a whole with profound spiritual teaching. Richard.
Darren.
So I think today we have a message that is solemn to some extent, but also hopeful.
Okay.
That's what I hope for people to be able to take away from this.
Sure.
I think that's my aspiration. I think one of the most difficult things in life can be finding meaning or even teaching in the most trying experiences that we have.
Indeed.
And even today, of course, people have the most, or they enjoy the most horrifying things, despite how far we've come in our world. But I do think that there is solace and even hope that we can offer to people who may be going through something difficult, or even people who are trying to make peace with some experience that they've been through in the past. And so what I wanted to focus on today was how we can make the best of even the most difficult situations in life, even when it feels like the worst.
Yeah.
I think that's essentially the message that I'd like to explore today with you. You know, one thing that comes to mind as we were preparing the show before is I remember there's a story you told me previously about a radio show you'd done. And someone who had phoned into that show who had previously been always in the depths of despair.
Yeah.
And had called into the show to share what their experience had been, just listening to some of the things that you were talking about on radio.
It's true. I think I'd like to tell that story, but I'd just like to preface it by saying, when we look at other people and the difficulties they're in, we have to know that these are measured in their internal state of being. So let me give an example. There's a great yogi, one of my personal heroes, a flawed person who made terrible mistakes in his youth but became enlightened. His name is Milarepa. We've talked about him before. But a lot of people looked at him. He took an absolute path of renunciation. He kind of starved himself, or he had a very, very minimal diet. He looked like a sad, lost, wandering vagrant to many people, and people felt sorry for him sometimes when they saw him. But this individual reached the highest states of elation and powers for good, powers to serve. He said that he did it only to serve the world, that he felt that he believed or knew that he had to attain this level of enlightenment in order to help the world. And that's, he said, why he did it. But my point being, a lot of people look at a person like that who was living a pretty hermetic life and think, God, he must be very lonely. He hasn't got any good food. He doesn't look in the best of health. What a sad, lost character he is. And he was a person who'd actually found himself more than they had by a long shot. So we have to just, that's the first measure of it. But what happened in Manchester was I just released a book called The Little Book of Karma. And that was very popular at the time in several languages. And I was doing a show up in Manchester on Piccadilly Radio with a man called James Stanage. Who I was a regular on that show at the time. And he had a lot of listeners, actually, who were very troubled people. Some of them had their children murdered, and they'd ring in. There were very difficult situations indeed up there among his listeners. I was talking about karma and reincarnation, and particularly about the tests that come along. The theme of this show, that there are, if you can try, even in the worst scenario, to find some good, something you've gained, even if it's inner strength, from the hardest situations, and therefore some benefit, some meaning, some purpose, it'll help to get you through it. And unbeknown to me, there was somebody listening. This is an anecdote. I can only go by what the person says, who was listening, who had decided to take their life, and they had even had the pills. They were on a shelf, and they had the radio on, and they heard me saying this, and they said that as I said it, a light went on in the room, just a spiritual light, but a physically visible light went on in the room. And they threw the pills away and decided to live and phoned the station.
Right.
And the station got this person into counselling. And I heard from her when I used to do the show probably every year for a while. She'd ring in, she's still going. So as far as I know, according to her, that just hearing that about karma turned it around. So what I learned from that is that giving people sympathy can be necessary, but it's not enough. If you can give people meaning, that's far more valuable to them.
Yeah, I completely resonate with that. And just to come back to your first point that you had made there, that, you know, when it's difficult to look at somebody else and actually understand. But because there was a point in my life where, from the outside, I think it probably looked pretty bad. But to me, I was like, oh my God, I'm finally making progress. I feel like I'm finally, you know, I felt like I was starting to face a lot of things that were within me and actually moving forward on my spiritual path. And so I was like, it was difficult, but there was a part of me that was overjoyed. And I'm not trying to say that that's what other people feel in various other difficult situations and all that, but there is an aspect of that which is you can be going through a difficult situation, but there, if the why is obvious to you, and you can see that there is progress that you are making towards this greater goal, then actually it can be that there's something that's even inspiring about it. I think that there's a quote from someone, I can't remember, this is not a quote of the week, but is a man who has a why can endure all hows or something. And so it's sort of like, you know, if you have a why, you can endure all of these things. That's sort of the message. But
and also, you know, people have they're conditioned. And so you're told to be a happy, fulfilled person, you need X, Y, and Z. We've talked about this before. So you need to have the money, the partner, the family, the job, whatever it is. And yet, there are plenty of people who, on the face of it, have those things who are not feeling fulfilled. They feel they should be. They may play it out and act as though they do, and yet something within them isn't, and it can lead to tragic consequences. And other people who have very little, materially speaking, who appreciate what they've got. You know, I always remember there was a silly book, some people will know of it, it's more of my generation, probably the Jeeves books with Bertie Wooster and all that, but you see on television as well. But anyway, this fellow who was like a bit of a twit, really, an upper class twit, but he would go out and he'd sort of say something like, the sun is out, the butterflies are in the air, the meadow is smelling good, all is well with the world, you know. And it was almost ridiculed. But if you feel, if that's enough for you, actually he was a rich person, but that's by the by. Point being, if you take a person that's enough for them, you can get an artist, for example, who paints the same scene over and over again, every day, the same mountain or something. And a lot of people look at that's very boring, but this person is seeing new things in that mountain every day and leaving works of art. And this is what drives them. And some of the things that other people might feel they need don't drive them. So it is finding your meaning, and I'm going to say it does depend to some extent how evolved you are. It's not a competition at all, but some people will be satisfied by certain things and others will need more of a spiritual dimension, and some will need a purpose. I mean, Schweitzer said, of course, you know, no one will be happy, or words to this effect, the only people will be happy are those who found out how they are meant to serve. And we've all got a destiny, and if we find that destiny, we find that meaning and that purpose, and we stick to it, we'll still need to feed it from within. Never neglect that, because things can go really badly wrong if you neglect that. But if we do stick to it, then, we can get through terribly difficult things. I mean, I think people could look at my life and your life probably think, why are you spending all the time working on spiritual matters? You're not out having fun, you're not in the pub, you're not out playing football, you're not, and think, what a dull, poor chap, but actually they don't know the elevation that one can go through doing this kind of work.
Yeah, it's a good point. I'd like to come back again to what you were saying about karma and reincarnation, because you were just starting to touch on this.
Yeah.
And I think, when you begin to contemplate the why and try to find the meaning or the teaching in any particular experience, the sort of insight into karma and reincarnation, I think, can be very helpful for people.
It can. Yeah. It can. And, I will say that I do think psychology, and I've talked to psychologists about this, and psychotherapy and psychiatry, which don't somehow incorporate reincarnation, are limited by that.
Sure.
Not saying they do no good, and I'm not saying you shouldn't go to them. So please, let's get that straight. They may well help a lot of people. But I do think just focusing on childhood and not taking into account, even if you don't know it, this is a soul who's had many lives and many experiences. That's what's framing them. It's not all just based on what happens in their childhood years, as some psychologists would, like Freud, for example, would have tended to say. So reincarnation's a massive factor. It's why we can have certain attributes. Some of us remember bits about our past lives, but you don't need to. You might not know who you were, but you might just feel familiar with certain things. You understand them without being told. I've met people actually my professor at university went to Calcutta for the first time, and he knew which streets would lead where, and he'd never seen a map, just remembered. And he got very interested in Buddhism after that.
Wow, okay.
This happens to people, or it can be something perhaps less specific but more useful, such as you have a facility for music, or you have you understand people, or these are things, or you meet someone that you already know. You kind of know, why do I know this person? Yes, we may well know them from a former life and they've come back. But I will say this about childhood, though. We are given, by karma, the experiences we need. That's very difficult. It's a very great relief to know that, though, because then you remove the element of unfairness. People might be being unfair on you, yes.
Sure.
You might be being abused, which is a terrible thing, and that's terribly wrong. But somehow, in that experience is something you need, probably for a past life reason. And that is hard to grasp in some situations when you look at the state of some people's lives, but it's a great strengthening factor. And sometimes also in your childhood, you'll be given, I had one experience which I didn't understand for actually really properly for decades. It wasn't awful, but it was a very odd one. Because when I was 10 years old, I had a sort of a gang, you might call it. When you're 10, you don't really know what's what. It wasn't a kind of gang that went around beating people up like we think. It was just a gang of boys at a boys' school, and we had a very organised system between us. So if we were playing games, like we used to Cops and Robbers or another game, your kids, your boys, you had 20 people doing it instead of 3, and it was just a better game. Yeah. It was quite simple, and it was organised, but it obviously worried the teachers. And I remember walking across the playground one day, and there was like 20 of us walking across together. And I think that I didn't see it then, I was only 10. To me, it was perfectly natural. It must have worried them. Anyway, when I went back, this is the thing that I found very odd, the next term, they put me a year ahead with boys a year older than me, and I was in the sort of top stream, so they're very brainy boys, and I had to sort of cope with that.
Yeah, interesting.
And they probably thought, that'll end that gang. I don't know what they thought.
Interesting.
But I think they were wrong, but that's up to them. But anyway, the point I'm making is really that nobody explained that to me. No teacher, especially in those days in a boys' prep school in England, came, well, look, Lawrence, we think you need this, and we were doing this for that reason, and this is why it's happening. Anything encouraging, helpful, or even telling me off, or nothing, just that. I think, even at that young age, it gave me a distrust of the establishment. which was the teachers,
Interesting.
if you like.
Yeah.
I thought they're not honest. They're not leveling with me. And later on, many years later, when I was campaigning on UFOs and other things, and we were being lied to, and the things were being covered up in the media right in front of me.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember one Fleet Street, as it was in England, the newspapers were in Fleet Street, editorial team saying to me, when I had a really proven story, saying, look, Richard, what do you want from us? I mean, our readers don't want the truth. Our readers want the truth they want to read.
Yeah.
That was one of the most honest journalists, So I think it gave me a bit of a fighting spirit. So there's a reason for all these things happening, even if you don't know what it is. Yeah. And it can pay off for you, and it's all by design. And sometimes it's a very testing situation. I mean, that wasn't the worst thing that's ever happened to anyone by a long chalk, but some real testing, challenging things, and it can be really hard. If you can develop, there's a statement actually in the 12 Blessings, make your brain live in everlasting thankfulness for experience. It's a very difficult thing to do when the experiences are tough. But if you can, it's a liberator. And it will throw off a lot of the stresses and strains in your mind. It's a bit like forgiveness in that way.
Yeah, true.
You're no longer sort of hampered by, this is unfair, this is wrong, poor old me, or all the stuff that we can all think.
Yeah, sure.
Which is illusional, really, because in the end, there is a reason. And some of the greatest people in history have had really tough tests to get to where they finally got to. And we all need those experiences at some point to reach enlightenment.
I think it's great to put it in that context, and I think what you've just said there's a great segue into the quote and actually the person of the week that I wanted to share today. So the person is Madame Blavatsky.
Oh yeah, wonderful.
I think someone who faced and overcame adversity throughout her life.
Yeah.
As someone who's incredibly influential on modern spirituality.
Absolutely. A great lady, a very brave woman.
Absolutely.
I mean, there was a woman who was in those days in Victorian England, a Russian divorcee, which some people frowned upon in those days, pioneering teachings which went against the church on the face of it, and which were very radical. And she had real guts and real bravery. Yeah.
Well, I think it would be difficult to imagine the New Age movement today without the theosophical she shared, as the result that she did. But one of the things she shared, which I want to share on the show today, is this. She said, do not be afraid of your difficulties. Do not wish you could be in other circumstances than you are. For when you have made the best of an adversity, it becomes the stepping stone to a splendid opportunity.
Absolutely true. And I mean, she was another one who had foul rumors spoken about her, horrible allegations made against her, as did Swami Vivekananda, as have many of the yogis. I'm not saying they're all untrue, but quite a lot of them are completely untrue, as did actually, as I say, Vivekananda, Yogananda, and many others. And it happens, and it will happen to people who have become spiritual teachers or even campaigners for some. I mean, the early campaigners for the slave trade, at least one of them was accused of having an affair with a slave girl who he'd never met. And this is what happens. And Madame Blavatsky, I remember sitting with Dr. King, and it was, I think, might have been the 100th anniversary of her birth. Okay, yeah. And we were, just the two of us were having dinner in Los Angeles, and a book had just come out, 100 years after her birth, I think it was, absolutely trashing her. And it was really laying into her with horrible stories and horrible allegations. And we were talking about it, and Dr. King was aware of it. It annoyed him, and he stood up and he said, well, she's in the Great White Brotherhood now. And actually, that doesn't mean she's ascended, by the way, but you can be in that fraternity while being unascended too. You can be attached to it or be a student, as she was, of ascended masters. Yeah. So, she really did withstand those terrible things. And that's a big thing, turning adversity to advantage. You know the story of Samson?
Go on.
And Samson was a great adept, actually, and someone that Dr. King knew very well. And he explained to me this riddle that's in the Bible, and some will have heard of it, of he had to go out and wrestle with a lion, quite similar actually to Hercules, who also had to wrestle with a lion. There are parallels there for a very good reason, which is that they're the same intelligence. But anyway, he wrestled with this lion, and then from the carcass came forth honey. And that he then went to his people and said, there's a riddle, what is the meaning of that riddle? And Dr. King, I don't think it's actually answered in the Bible what the meaning is, but Dr. King explained to me the meaning of it, which is turning adversity into advantage. From some bad situation, actually, the killing of a lion, to save lives in the village, came forth honey. And that's a key element of the adepts, of some of the great adepts, taking a bad situation and turning it into something great.
Yeah, she even uses the words here about it becoming the stepping stone to a splendid opportunity.
Yeah.
And when we think about these different, tests and difficult experiences that we face in our life, I think you mentioned at the beginning of the show, there are some experiences that people have that become like this crucible of transformation, and because of it, which was extremely challenging at the time, maybe they turn to the spiritual path, or they turn.
Oh yeah, I've met many actually. Well, I say many. I would say probably maybe even dozens over the years of various events that I've run, of people who've told me they came to this through a crisis. Sometimes a mental breakdown, sometimes a health crisis, sometimes a relationship crisis. They're always going on in their life, and then something awful happened. And they've also said to me, many of them, it was the best thing that ever happened to them, which sounds really odd, I'm sure. But because what it did, it turned them inwards to their inner life. Brings us back to Milarepa. It's all going on within. Happiness, peace, fulfillment, realization is an inner state. So getting everything in line in your outer world is not enough. Even getting everything in line in your service world is not enough necessarily, because you've got to feed that inner flame when you get that opportunity, or it could burn out. And then you'll suddenly think, well, why am I doing this? I don't feel motivated to do this. And you could really lose your way.
I think as well as that, when you think of people who have been through extremely horrific experiences, very challenging in one way or another, but to be able to come out of that and to be able to share that with the world as a teaching that can help other people, not just people who may have been through something similar, but as an example of what not to do and what we can do instead, to be an inspiration. I watched a film a few years ago, I remember, that one just came to my mind. It was the story of a man who was struck down with I think it was polio, or very debilitating disease in which he had become completely paralyzed. But because of his just will and zest for life, and not wanting to be stuck in a capsule for the rest of his existence, there was a kind of inspired inventor or doctor that he worked with who made it possible for him to move around and in this wheelchair and still enjoy a lot of life. And then a lot of people with the same condition began to realize, well, I can do that as well.
Oh yeah,
I'm not just trapped in this way. So and other people who may be born with various disabilities of one kind or another, for them to still pursue life in a way that most people who don't even have one, to do it more than they do, and to see that, oh, actually, there's someone who's in a far worse situation than me, and yet they're going out and doing all of this stuff, to making this impact, being able to inspire and other people.
True. And the other thing, of course, if you're really honest, you can learn discrimination by your mistakes. Very much in the psychic area, which is my area, one of my areas, of course, and mediumship. And very early on when I started, and it was Dr. King who really set me up with crystal ball readings and so forth. He even designed the cover for my crystal ball, gave me the crystal ball. I was doing a lot of readings. And then I moved into the area of mediumship, and I didn't tell him. And I was even having people speaking through me, and I didn't realize, but I was entering a slightly negative trance. It wasn't a fully concentrated state, as it should have been. It was an error on my part. I don't use that now. I receive direct reception through enhanced concentration and more than concentration. But that was when I started, and I got a communicator by the name of Saint Rock. And of course, I at the time was very interested in Saint Peter, which was an order that Dr. King started to do with St. Peter. And he had been a channel for St. Peter, and St. Peter described himself as the rock. He said, I am the rock. So the mistake I made, which I shouldn't have made, this is right at the beginning, perhaps in the very early 1980s, was I thought I was getting St. Peter because of the name rock. I wasn't going deeply into it, and I was using this trance condition I shouldn't have been using, really. And St. Rock's a wonderful man and a great healer, but it's not St. Peter.
Sure.
I did tell Dr. King, because I kept him informed, and he actually checked with St. Peter, or checked, he took it that seriously and put me straight. Now, at that point, I thought, oh my gosh, I've gone right off the rails. Let's forget this. It's not working. I won't channel anymore. And Dr. King told me, no, carry on. You've gone wrong. Learn the lesson. Maybe your guides went wrong. I learned many things from this. One of the things I learned from this was a newfound sympathy for guides, by the way, because a guide who communicates through a medium, if the medium, which is very common, thinks they're someone else, or even if it's, say, a Christian who thinks they're hearing from the Virgin Mary, what does the guide do? Do they carry on getting their message through, or do they stop? And so it's difficult. Anyway, the long and the short of it, just to give it, I then took up intensive concentration. I stopped thinking about anything other than just getting the message, getting the details, and above all, keeping my intuition alive.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, you go off into trance and you blank it out or block it out, you can go off at a tangent. This is just a sort of psychic example of where a lesson actually got me to really improve my mediumship, and I waited 25 years after that before I ever published anything of this channeling, because I was really careful, and now I know what I've got. I run it by my intuition. I get it is sometimes just the letters of the words. I check out identities. I get absolutely certain proof before. And in fact, interestingly, one of the people, and it must have been probably, I don't know, maybe 30 years after this, that did communicate with me, is the very person we're talking about today, Madame Blavatsky. But if I hadn't made that mistake, been put straight, learned from it. I think a lot of mediums do make mistakes, and they're not open to being corrected, and they haven't got a great teacher behind them, like I was lucky enough to have, and they go well off down the line, and maybe their vanity comes in, and they start to believe what they want to believe, and so much can go wrong. But from the mistakes, and accepting the mistakes and learning from them, can come the greatest results.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. By the way, anybody, if you're watching this, you can find out more about that contact with Madame Blavatsky in episode 111. But I think just back to your point there, Richard, I think, we started this episode, well, how do we make the best of situations, right? I think that last example you gave really does speak to how, one way in which you can make the best of it. And when you're really mining that teaching and the lesson that's possible from that experience, then you're getting the most value possible from having gone through it.
And you've got to be able to admit when you're wrong to yourself. You don't necessarily have to admit to everybody else. That depends whether you can trust them or not, and whether they'll use it correctly, or whether you'll set them the wrong example and they'll get the wrong idea from it. But you have to know when you've done something wrong, and it can be quite a painful thing to acknowledge, but not give up. That's the lesson I learned. And when Dr. King said, no, don't, carry on. And funny enough, he came over to England not too long after that and asked me to give him a reading.
Really?
Can you imagine doing that? Psychic reading. So he was still, he was very encouraging, while at the same time correcting me from the source.
Well, I think that's very much turning adversity to advantage, and I think very much the message that we want to leave people.
In whatever arena or field you're in. Well,
thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you.
Now, what I took away from that conversation with Richard was that if you can try, even in the most difficult scenarios, to find something you've gained, even if that's inner strength, something that can give you a sense of purpose, something that was a benefit, something that can give you meaning, that will help you to get through it. Yes, you can give someone sympathy, but that's rarely enough. But if you can give them meaning, then that's far more valuable. The truth is that karma gives us the experiences that we need based on our past, even our past lives, not as a punishment, but as a teacher. And when we face those difficult experiences, that can be a great relief because it removes that element, that feeling of unfairness, right? There is a reason for it. And that can be a great liberator, because from the standpoint of our soul, all of these experiences and these vital lessons that we're afforded by them are to help us towards our destiny of enlightenment. But possibly the most important message that we talked about today was about turning adversity into advantage, just like Madame Blavatsky. It's about taking those very difficult tests and experiences that we face and turning them into something extremely positive, not just for ourselves, but for others. And she was an incredible example of that. Now, if you enjoyed that episode about karma, check out this video over here that goes deeper into learning from your past lives, or this video over here that talks more about spirit guides and the role that they can play in your lives too. Thanks for tuning into the show, and see you next time.